On a cliff above the Pacific, in a darkness so complete that even the rain seemed to fall without direction, a man held something small and dying against his chest. His hands were bleeding. The wind had stripped every sound from the night except the roar of water below and the faint, almost imperceptible tremor of a heartbeat that did not belong to him. He could feel it through his soaked uniform, through the fabric and the cold, and the years of scar tissue he had built around himself like a second skeleton. A pulse so fragile, it seemed to exist only as a question. And the question was whether anyone in this world still cared enough to answer. He stood at the edge of the culvert where the earth had given way, boots sinking into mud that wanted to pull him under, and for one breath, he did not move. The storm screamed. The ocean swallowed the base of the cliff in white fury, and in his arms, the creature shivered once, then went still. That night, he was not looking for a miracle. He was not looking for anything at all. He had driven into the storm the way a man drives into silence, seeking only the absence of memory, the temporary mercy of motion without destination. But something cried out in the dark, and he stopped. Sometimes that is exactly how God brings us back to hope. Not with thunder, not with angels, but with a sound so small it could be missed by anyone who had already decided not to listen. Before we go further, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And stay with me, because this story will take you somewhere you did not expect. 6 hours earlier, the world looked like this. Astoria, Oregon always carried the expression of a place that remembered more than it wanted to say. Especially on nights like this one, when the Pacific turned the sky the color of poured lead and the wind came off the water with a hard, salt-stung edge that made every breath feel borrowed from something larger and less forgiving than yourself. The rain did not fall so much as it struck. Thin, slanting needles that skittered across the coastal highway and cut sideways through the dark green pines gripping the cliffs above the river mouth. The town itself sat tucked between forest and sea, fishing boats rocking in gray swells. Old weathered buildings leaning into the damp like they had learned to live with constant weight. And up on the ridges, the narrow roads wound along drop-offs where the ocean's breath rose as mist, and every curve carried the quiet threat of slick asphalt and unseen debris. It was the kind of weather that emptied sidewalks and kept conversations short. The kind that made a person grateful for distance and angry at it in the same moment. And for the man driving alone along the cliffside forest road outside of town distance was not just a preference, it was a method of survival. Colton Briggs was 39 years old, though the number meant less than the mileage behind it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a compact athletic build that looked forged rather than trained, the kind of frame that came from years of carrying weight no one else could see. He wore a full Navy working uniform, Type 3 long-sleeve blouse, and matching trousers in AOR2 digital camouflage woodland pattern. No civilian layers beneath it, paired with standard brown combat boots whose soles still bit into surfaces, as though they expected an extraction point at every stop. His face was stern and angular, weathered skin showing realistic pores and fine lines as if the years had sandblasted him from the inside out. Steel blue eyes set beneath a brow that rarely softened. A short ash-brown beard threaded with subtle gray. Regulation haircut flattened by the damp as he leaned forward behind the wheel. Even without insignia announcing it, there was no hiding what he was. It lived in the way he moved, disciplined posture, shoulders squared as if he wore an invisible ruck, hands positioned with a deliberate economy that wasted nothing, not motion, not energy, not attention. His pickup truck rattled over patched pavement and scattered gravel. Headlights carved tunnels through rain and mist. The windshield wipers scraped back and forth with a harsh, hypnotic rhythm that filled the cab like a metronome set to the tempo of thoughts he refused to name. He had not been looking for anything tonight. Not a mission. Not a story. Not a reason to slow down. If he was honest with himself, and he was rarely honest with himself anymore, he was not even looking for peace, because peace required a kind of trust he had stopped carrying a long time ago. But the habit of scanning never left him. The old combat reflex that treated every curve as a blind corner and every shadow as a potential threat, even when the only enemy was memory. His eyes swept the tree line, the ditch, the shoulder, then the road ahead, reading the landscape the way other people read faces. And on the edge of his awareness, he kept counting distance to the next turnout. How much the tires could hold on wet rock, where the slope steepened into nothing but air and gravity. He told himself it was caution, common sense on a night like this, but the truth sat deeper, heavy and unspoken in the hollow space between his ribs. It was easier to watch for dangers outside than to let the ones inside rise and speak. His right hand drifted to his chest pocket where a small metal object pressed against his heartbeat through the damp fabric. A military dog tag on a short chain. He touched it without looking at it the way a man touches a wound he has learned to carry, but never learned to examine. Whatever name was stamped into that steel, he had not read it in years, and he was not going to read it tonight. Beside him, neither speaking nor absent, sat the only presence he still trusted without question. Coda was a German shepherd from a working line, full grown and in his prime, with a dense double coat that read as sable black with rich tan points when light caught it right. His build was powerful without bulk, shoulders rolling quietly as he adjusted to the truck's movement. Amber brown eyes alert and intelligent, ears upright and responsive like antennae tuned to frequencies most people forgot existed. His muzzle was strong and clean breath, steady posture, controlled. And there was something in his stillness that did not look like obedience so much as shared discipline. The kind that came from repetition under pressure and a bond built on consistency rather than affection. Coda rode angled close enough to the center console that he could see through the windshield when he chose, and right now his gaze was fixed forward. Not frantic, not restless, just present, reading the air itself, salt, wet bark, mud, the faint metallic tang of runoff. A map of invisible signals that only he could interpret. Colton did not talk to him much. Not the way people talk to pets. He did not need to. They operated like a two-man team, even in silence. One mind measuring distances and angles. The other measuring scent and sound, each filling the gaps the other could not cover. The road tightened along the cliff as the forest pressed closer. Pines bending under gusts that snapped their branches like knuckles cracking in a dark room. The rain intensified into a hard hiss that made the world feel small and aggressive. The truck's heater fought the damp but could not push it all the way out, leaving a cold that seeped into Colton's bones through fabric and memory alike. He kept his jaw set, eyes forward, as if the only rule that mattered was the oldest one he knew. Keep moving, Then something cut through the noise that did not belong. A bark. Sharp. Urgent. Half swallowed by wind and distorted by rain, but unmistakably alive. It came again higher this time, frayed at the edges. Not the territorial warning of a dog defending ground, but the desperate insistence of a creature calling into an indifferent storm, begging the darkness to send someone, anyone, before it was too late. Colton's hands tightened on the wheel in automatic resistance. The part of him that had survived by not stopping immediately argued back. It could be nothing. Or worse, it could be a problem that would pull him into something he could not walk away from unchanged. He kept driving for 2 more seconds, maybe 3. But beside him, Coda's entire body changed. Muscles went rigid in a clean coiled line. Ears angled hard toward the passenger side window. Nose lifting as if the dog had caught a thread of scent and refused to let go. Coda did not bark back. He did not whine or pace. He simply locked onto a point in the darkness with a certainty that made Colton's chest tighten. Because it was not emotion in the dog's posture. It was information. Coda leaned forward slightly, head turned toward the ditch line ahead, and in that small, disciplined movement was a silent command more persuasive than any plea. There is something here, and it is running out of time. Colton exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled release, the kind he used before breaching a door or stepping into a space where everything could go wrong in the span of a single heartbeat. He eased his foot off the gas and let the truck roll forward as he scanned for a safe shoulder. Wet gravel glittered like teeth under the headlights. He found a narrow turnout where the road widened by a few feet and guided the truck into it with the same precision he used for everything. Tires crunching, engine idling low. The wind slapped the cab, shaking it as if the storm resented being interrupted. For a moment he stayed still, listening, letting the wipers scrape and the rain drum the roof. The bark came again closer, now rising from somewhere ahead and below the road. Coda shifted his gaze to Colton as if awaiting permission, not to act wildly, but to do the job he had been bred and trained to do. Colton opened his door and stepped out. The cold hit him like a wall, rain striking his face and soaking the shoulders of his blouse within seconds. Mud sucked at his boots as he moved toward the ditch, and the smell of wet earth rose sharp and raw, mixed with the salty breath of the ocean drifting up through the trees. Coda dropped out behind him in perfect sync, staying close but not crowding. Posture low and steady, scanning the perimeter with quick silent checks as if they were moving through a hostile zone. Ahead, the sound sharpened into a frantic rhythm. Through the rain haze, Colton saw movement. Dark fur, a crouched shape, a tail held low, and then a flash of pale eyes reflecting the truck's headlights. A German shepherd female stood beside a culvert opening where runoff water funneled under the road into a rusted metal pipe. Her body was trembling so hard it looked like the storm was shaking her from inside. Coat slicked flat with rain, ribs faintly visible beneath wet fur, paws buried in mud that reached above her ankles. She was adult, but the kind of adult that hunger makes small. Hip bones sharp, shoulders narrow, muscles present but depleted. Her ears pinned back as she barked into the black mouth of the pipe, and then broke the bark into a wavering broken whine that sounded almost human. Her eyes were deep amber brown, wide with panic. And when she noticed Colton and Coda approaching, she did not lunge or flee. She simply swung her head toward them and barked once with a raw insistence that felt less like a warning and more like an instruction. Then she snapped her gaze back into the darkness of the pipe. Look, look, look. Colton froze for half a breath. The soldier in him immediately measured the slope, the water flow, the slickness of the mud, the distance to the edge, while the human in him felt the blunt impact of the scene, the way the mother's whole body was caught between exhaustion and refusal, the way her paws kept shifting as if she could not decide whether to fight the world or finally collapse beneath it. He lowered himself a few feet from her and kept his posture non-threatening. Voice low and calm, the tone he used when he needed something terrified to trust him. Easy, he said, not as comfort, as a directive, because he knew from experience that panic was contagious and steadiness was the only antidote that worked in the field. Coda stayed slightly behind and to the side, positioned like a protective wall, ears forward, eyes flicking between the mother and the dark opening of the pipe, reading the air with an intensity that raised the fur along the ridge of his neck. The mother barked again, then shoved her nose toward the culvert. Colton followed her line of sight and raised his flashlight. At first he saw only darkness, water glinting at the bottom like oil, leaves and debris spinning in the current, the mouth of the pipe swallowing the beam. Then the light caught two tiny shapes clinging to the metal lip just inside. German Shepherd puppies, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Their black and tan fur soaked in matted bodies pressed together for warmth that was not there. Paws scrabbling weakly against slick metal as water surged around their legs in fast, dirty pulses. Their cries were thin, almost lost beneath the rush. But the sound hit Colton's chest with the same sudden force as a distant distress call. Because it carried that particular frequency of helplessness that did not care who you were or what you had done. It simply demanded an answer. He moved back to the truck fast, but not reckless, boots biting into gravel as he yanked open the rear compartment and pulled out a steel crowbar stained with old rust, a coil of utility rope, heavy-duty work gloves, stiff from past use, and a waterproof flashlight that fit his palm like it belonged there. He returned to the ditch in 3 long strides as the wind shoved rain sideways into his face. The crowbar jammed into the seam of the rusted grate covering the culvert mouth. His boots slid half an inch before he corrected his stance and leaned his weight into the metal. The grate shrieked under pressure, a raw metallic protest that vibrated up through his forearms. He adjusted angle and leverage the way he had adjusted breaching tools in darker, louder places, pushing not with fury, but with calibrated force until the first bolt sheared and the grate lifted enough to wedge the bar deeper. Coda braced instinctively, pressing the solid weight of his body against Colton's outer leg, a living anchor that countered the slippery pull of gravity. When the grate finally tore free on one side with a grinding groan, Colton dropped the crowbar and seized the edge with gloved hands. He dragged it aside enough to open a gap and sent the flashlight beam into the pipe. The 2 small bodies clung to the inner lip, eyes wide and shining with blind fear. He slid down to one knee. Mud swallowed fabric, left hand gripping the concrete rim, right hand reaching into the freezing rush. The current was stronger than it looked from above. The cold was immediate and vicious, driving through glove and sleeve, biting at his skin like teeth. But he locked his jaw and extended his arm further until his fingers closed around a small trembling body. The first puppy weighed almost nothing, and yet felt impossibly fragile. Ribs sharp beneath soaked fur, heartbeat fluttering against his palm like a trapped bird. He lifted the pup free and set it just beyond the waterline where the mother could shield it. She lunged forward instantly, licking its face in short, frantic bursts that sounded like gratitude wrapped in panic. He would name that one Bravo later that night for the stubbornness of its grip, for the way it refused to let go. But the second pup had been forced deeper by the surge. It clung to a branch wedged inside the pipe debris, catching around its hind legs as water slapped against its side. Coda made a low, contained sound, ears flattening for an instant. Not fear, information. The water was rising faster. Colton shifted position, one boot deeper into the ditch. Coda pressed harder against his thigh weight, angled to counterbalance paws, digging deeper, as if locking them both into the earth itself. Colton leaned farther than safety advised, cold water surging up his forearm, the flashlight jittering as he twisted his wrist to free the branch. His fingers slipped. For one terrible second, he felt nothing but slick fur sliding through his grip and the pull of the current trying to steal what he had almost saved. The sensation ripped through him with a violence that had nothing to do with water or weather. It was older than this night, older than this cliff. It was a hand reaching through sand and smoke for someone who was already falling, and the crushing knowledge that he had been too slow. Then he lunged that final inch, caught the small body mid-surge, and pulled back with controlled force. The second puppy came free with a wet gasp of sound, limp except for a faint tremor. He drew it against his chest before lifting it clear. The mother surged forward, nose working over the pup's face, licking mud and water away with a devotion so fierce it looked like a kind of prayer. This one he would name Ember, for the small lighter patch on her chest that glowed like a coal beneath the mud, for the way she was almost extinguished before anyone found her. But before he could breathe, the hillside above them groaned, a deep sound, the sound of earth saturated beyond its capacity, shifting under its own weight. Gravel and small stones cascaded down the slope and rattled against the concrete lip of the culvert. The water roared louder through the pipe, slamming with a deeper, more aggressive tone. Colton's gaze snapped upward. Dark soil bleeding into the runoff in thin streams that hinted at something heavier waiting to fall. He made the call without hesitation. He crouched in front of the mother and met her amber eyes with a steadiness that did not waver, then jerked his chin toward the truck in a clear directional cue. "Move," he said, low, decisive, not pleading, not coaxing, instructing. He shifted the wrapped puppies more securely against his chest. The mother hesitated for half a heartbeat, torn between the pipe that had held her babies and the stranger who had pulled them free. Then she gathered close with a quick nudge and stepped after him, tail low, but no longer frozen. Coda fell into position automatically, slightly behind and to the outside, forming a protective arc that shielded the trio from the ditch and any sudden slide. They moved up the muddy incline together, boots and paws biting for purchase, shoulders squared against wind. Behind them, the culvert swallowed another surge with a deep metallic echo. The hillside groaned again, and the ground where they had knelt seconds earlier slid 2 feet toward the ravine in a slow, heavy exhale of earth giving up. Colton did not look back. He did not need to. Inside the truck, the heater fought the cold, while the mother pressed against the back seat and the puppies shivered against his chest beneath his soaked blouse. Coda rode beside them, posture alert, but no longer rigid, as if the mission had shifted from extraction to escort and the rules had softened just enough to allow proximity. The cabin appeared through rain and mist 20 minutes later. Small, weathered cedar, one flickering porch light, a narrow deck facing the Pacific, the kind of place a man rents when he wants to disappear without technically vanishing. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and unscented soap. He built a fire with efficient hands. Sparks leapt. Flame caught slowly, then grew into a steady crackle that painted the room in amber and gold. He laid the puppies on a folded wool blanket near the hearth and dried them in slow strokes that were firm enough to warm, but gentle enough not to startle. The mother hovered at the edge of the light, trembling, uncertain whether to collapse or stand guard. Coda lay down at a deliberate diagonal between her and the rest of the room, not threatening, not challenging, simply present, his chest rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm that seemed to set the tempo for the space itself. Minutes passed. The mother's trembling eased. Her tail uncurled just enough to brush the blanket. She lowered her chin beside her pups. Colton studied them. The braver one, darker saddle of fur, still trying to climb toward warmth. Bravo. The smaller one, lighter patch beneath the mud, cautious, observant, watching before moving. Ember. And the mother amber eyes following every breath in the room, who had stood in a storm and refused to leave her children even when leaving was the only logical choice. Willow. Because she had bent without breaking the way willows do. He did not explain the names. They simply arrived quieter than the storm outside and steadier than the weight in his own chest. Then he noticed something that made him pause. As he ran the towel along Willow's shoulder, his hand found a ridge beneath her fur. A scar. Old and healed, but deliberate, the kind left by a collar worn too tight for too long. And around her neck, the fur was thinner, rubbed away in a band that told a story of restraint rather than freedom. This was not a dog that had wandered into the wild on her own. Someone had owned her, and someone had let her go. He filed the detail away the way he filed anything that did not yet have enough context to act on, quietly, without reaction. But the information lodged itself beneath his ribs alongside the other things he carried, and it would not stay quiet for long. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire cracked and the cabin filled with the sound of breathing that was not his own. For the first time since he had rented this place, the silence felt different. Not hollow, not echoing with absence, but inhabited by something fragile that sighed and shifted and lived. And then, cutting through the stillness with a precision that made both Colton and Coda react in the same instant, came 3 firm knocks on the front door, spaced evenly, measured, not frantic. Coda rose into a full alert posture, ears locked forward, body angled toward the door, every muscle wound tight and ready. Colton was already on his feet, one hand reaching for the baseball bat leaning beside the door frame, eyes narrowed, jaw set. The mother lifted her head from the blanket and watched, ears half raised, reading the tension the way she had read the storm. And outside, the wind howled through the pines as if it had one more secret left to deliver before the night was through. Colton cracked the door just wide enough to control what came through it. Coda positioned at the inside angle weight forward, every muscle calibrated to the gap between the door and whatever the night had sent. Two women stood on the porch beneath the stuttering light. The first was 68 years old. Silver white hair pulled into a loose bun. Pale blue eyes steady behind wire-rimmed glasses the rain had spotted but not fogged. A heavy wool coat buttoned to the throat. She held a thermos in one gloved hand and a folded scarf in the other, standing with the composure of someone who had spent a lifetime arriving at doors behind which something had gone wrong. Dorothy Hargrove. Dot to everyone in Astoria. She had nursed for 31 years before arthritis claimed her hands. After that, she became the community dispatcher at the volunteer radio hub near the marina, listening to static and garbled voices and translating chaos into coordinates the way she had once translated symptoms into treatment. Her husband Walter, a firefighter, died 11 years ago beneath the collapsed roof of a warehouse on the industrial side of town. She never remarried, never left Astoria. Simply learned to carry grief in a way that let her keep walking toward whatever needed her next. Behind her stood Jessamine Whitford. Jess, 32. Tall and lean with strong shoulders and auburn hair darkened by rain plastered against the collar of a canvas jacket. Freckles scattered across a face that held gentleness and stubborn resolve in equal measure. She ran the volunteer animal shelter at the edge of town, a place sustained by donations and willpower, and the memory of her younger brother who died 6 years ago from an overdose nobody predicted, and everybody spent too long pretending they should have. That loss had hardened her against indifference, and deepened her instinct to stop for anything left alone on the roadside. Jess carried a crate lined with fleece, formula bottles in the side pocket, a medical kit slung across one shoulder. We heard about the culvert, Dot said. Calm, warm. The voice of a woman who had once talked a stranger through performing CPR on his own child over a crackling radio at 2 a.m. Radio chatter. Thought you might need supplies. Colton measured them in a single sweep. Age, posture, hands. Then his gaze shifted to the truck behind them, checking the cab and the tree line for anyone waiting in shadow. He did not soften his stance. He simply processed, the way he processed everything, threat or non-threat, obstacle or asset. Jess looked past him toward the firelight and saw the shapes near the hearth. The mother curled around two small bodies, the slow rise and fall of breath that had almost stopped hours ago, but had chosen to continue. Something in her expression shifted. Not pity, recognition. She noticed his hands, cuts along the knuckles, swelling where cold had settled into split skin. Those need proper cleaning, she said quietly. Not a suggestion. Dot extended the thermos. Ginger tea. Jess lifted the crate. Blankets, formula, antiseptic. Coda looked from one woman to the other, then back at Colton. Patient, holding position until his partner made the call. Colton stepped back. Not welcome. Necessity. The dogs needed what these women carried. He let them inside the threshold while keeping his position near the door body angled to see the women and the hallway and the window simultaneously. Jess knelt near the hearth movement slow enough to avoid alarming Willow. She placed the fleece blanket within reach of the pups without touching them. She understood that this mother's trust would come in fractions. Dot set the thermos on the table and studied the room with approval that asked nothing. Coda remained between the visitors and the rest of the cabin. No growl, no display. Presence, the living definition of a boundary. They stay, Colton said, low, flat, directed at the room rather than any person. Overnight, the women exchanged a glance that carried years of understanding between people who read silence better than speech. They finished their work, checked the pups, left instructions, promised open radios. Then they drove into the rain, leaving Colton alone with 3 lives he had not asked for, and one he had carried so long it felt like bone. The days that followed moved with the rhythm of things, learning to trust the ground beneath them. Willow stopped trembling on the second morning. She ate cautiously, at first approaching the bowl with the wariness of a creature that had been hungry long enough to suspect generosity. Then, with growing steadiness, as each meal arrived without cost. Her ribs were still visible but softening. The dull edge in her eyes had begun to brighten into intelligence rather than survival. Bravo discovered that cabin floors were not made of mud and celebrated by scaling everything within reach. The hearthstones, chair legs, Colton's boot. He was bold in the way only creatures pulled from the edge of death are bold, as if nearly drowning had burned away whatever mechanism might have taught him fear. Colton corrected him with a firm no and a redirect, and the pup would consider this instruction for approximately 2 seconds before attempting the same climb from a new angle. Ember was nothing like her brother. She observed before she moved. She did not scramble onto Colton's boot so much as arrive beside it, placing her body against the leather with a deliberateness that was less shyness than verdict. Once there, she did not leave. She followed him from hearth to kitchen to porch, with a constancy that in another creature might have been dependence, but in Ember was decision. She had selected him. The selection was quiet and absolute and beyond appeal. Coda governed the space among them with discipline that came from understanding rather than command. He did not challenge Willow for territory or posture over her when she ate. He moved through the cabin with an authority that established order through presence alone, the way a veteran officer moves through a room full of younger soldiers without raising his voice. When Bravo tumbled toward the fireplace, Coda occupied the dangerous space before the pup could reach it. No bark, no snap. Just a body in the right position at the right time, absorbing the impact of a clumsy puppy without losing composure. When Willow tensed at Gust, shaking the windows, Coda lay nearby and breathed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, demonstrating through his own body that this room was not a place that required fear. And gradually, over the course of those quiet days, Willow began to mirror that rhythm. Her breathing slowed when his slowed. Her muscles released when his released, as if steadiness could be taught through proximity alone. Colton watched all of this without comment, but something behind his eyes shifted during those days. He had understood discipline his entire adult life as a survival instrument, a mechanism for enduring environments designed to break human beings apart. Watching Coda use that identical discipline to build safety rather than enforce compliance was like hearing a word he had spoken 1,000 times suddenly pronounced in a way that exposed a meaning he had never once considered. Discipline as shelter, structure as kindness. Order not as control, but as the architecture that allowed fragile things to grow without being crushed. On the third night, the storm returned. It had retreated behind the horizon to gather mass, and when it came back harder. Wind screamed through the eaves. Glass vibrated in the frames. The power died, leaving only firelight that threw trembling shadows across every surface. Colton stood near the window, watching the tree line bend horizontal, Willow lay by the hearth with Bravo against her flank ears twitching at every shift instinct whispering that the world outside had not finished. The gust came without warning. It struck the cabin hard enough to rattle the latch on the back door. Colton had secured it earlier but had not rechecked it after carrying in firewood. The latch shifted. The frame opened a fraction. A blade of cold air sliced into the room. Bravo squeaked. Willow's head snapped up. Ember reacted not to the cold, but to a sound that came through the gap. Something metallic clanging outside. A gutter or a tool striking wood. Sharp. Alien. It pulled her forward the way a thread pulls a needle. The door eased open another inch under the next gust, and Ember slipped through. 3 seconds. That is how long it took Colton to register the missing shape on the blanket, to count bodies and find one absent. His own body was moving before the number settled. Coda pivoted toward the draft in the same breath, nostrils wide, catching the fresh scent trail cutting into the storm. He moved to the door and launched into the night with a purpose that was not obedience, but partnership. Colton followed. Cold hit like detonation. The hill behind the cabin sloped toward a drainage channel feeding into a ravine, and rain had turned every surface into a negotiation between gravity and luck. Coda worked the wind methodically, zigzagging, nose dipping and rising, reading the ground with pause the way fingers read a language only he understood. Halfway down, Colton's boot hit clay that had turned to glass beneath the water. His feet went, and his right knee struck buried stone with an impact that sent white light through his skull. In that light, the world became somewhere else. Wind became rotors. Rain became sand. His hands were not on Oregon mud, but on the metal floor of a helicopter bay that smelled of hydraulic fluid and copper. Below him, a hand reached up through dust and noise. Brown skin slick with sweat. Fingers open. He reached back. In this memory, he always reached back, and his fingers always closed on air, and the hand always fell. His body locked on the hillside. Breath gone. Muscles braced for a concussion wave that existed only inside his nervous system. Coda came back for him, not circling. Direct. He pressed his full shoulder weight into Colton's ribs with a force that was not gentle, but was precise. A physical fact introduced into a neurological fiction. Then one bark. Short. Clean. Cutting through the storm and through the desert and through 4 years as cleanly as a blade cuts rope. Come back. You are here. Now. Colton's lungs remembered. He focused on pressure against his ribs. Wet fur instead of cordite. Mud instead of metal. Oregon. This night. No other. He stood. His knee screamed. He ignored it. Find, he said, ragged but functional. Coda turned and ran. They worked the lower slope past the drainage channel into brambles along the ravine where thorn bushes grew in walls. Coda moved in bursts, checking, then freezing, tail rigid, ears locked on a cluster of roots half submerged in runoff. Colton heard it. Thin. A ghost of sound beneath wind. A whimper without enough strength to qualify as a whimper. He dropped and tore into thorns with bare hands. Branches cut his palms and reopened culvert wounds. He did not slow. Somewhere in the tangle, a 7-week-old puppy was running out of time, and he had already failed to hold on once tonight in a place that existed only inside his skull, and he would not fail in a place that was real. Ember lay wedged between roots, fur flattened, one hind paw twisted in thorn, eyes glassy. She did not cry when he touched her. She trembled harder, which was worse because sound means strength and silence means the strength is almost gone. He freed her with hands that shook, not cold. Something deeper. He lifted her against his chest and held her there with both arms, the way you hold something you have just realized you cannot lose. Her heartbeat was thin and rapid against his sternum. Coda flanked the climb back, guarding, scanning. But once, just once, his ears flicked backward toward Colton in acknowledgement. She is safe. We go home now. Fever came the next morning like a second storm arriving behind the first, quieter at first, but deeper in its reach and more patient in its destruction. Colton's skin burned with heat that had nothing to do with the hearth. His body had carried him through cold water and adrenaline and sleeplessness, and now it presented the bill. He lay rigid on the narrow bed jaw, clenched, breathing in uneven pulls, like a man arguing with his lungs about whether they still needed to function. Coda lay along the mattress edge, body angled toward the door, one ear tilted toward the hallway, breathing in rhythm so steady it seemed deliberate, as if setting a pace for the man beside him whose own pace had broken. Jess arrived at first light. Cold cloths, clean bandages, water during the brief windows when fever loosened its hold. The cabin held a fragile truce between recovery and collapse, and the dogs seemed to understand it. Willow stayed near the hearth, Bravo tucked against her. Ember lay facing the bedroom hallway with an attention that did not waver. Garrett Howe arrived on the second afternoon. Jess heard the engine first, cleaner than Astoria trucks, too well maintained. She watched a man step from a dark Greene County truck with the confidence of someone who considered his presence sufficient announcement. Approximately 50, dense through the shoulders in a way suggesting former fitness maintained by stubbornness. Sandy brown hair cropped short, thinning at the temples. Clean jaw. County animal control jacket with the insignia neat on the chest. Clipboard in one hand. Expression of pleasant authority fitted to his face like a mask one size too tight. Garrett Howe had held his position 9 years. Before that, he had been something else. Astoria did not ask. The silence around his past had settled into local mystery, the kind small towns maintain not from respect, but from the understanding that some answers reshape everything around them. 3 knocks. Measured. Jess stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut. Ms. Whitford? Howe smiled, the kind that reaches exactly far enough to qualify as polite. Incident on the Cliff Road. Dogs recovered from a culvert. No registration, no vaccination records. He consulted his clipboard with the performance of a man who knew everything on it. Protocol requires a welfare inspection on unregistered animals. The dogs are cared for, Jess replied. Level. She knew from experience that emotion was the first thing bureaucracy weaponized. Warm-fed supervised. Vet records within the week. Appreciated. However, protocol requires visual confirmation. If the animals are not chipped or registered, we may need to discuss interim custody until documentation is filed. He said, custody, the way a locksmith says, tumbler. Technical, but carrying the implication that something was about to be opened or closed whether she consented or not. Return with formal paperwork and an appointment. Jess said, the property owner is unwell. Today is not possible. Howe's gaze drifted past her to the window where firelight glowed behind the curtain. He looked 3 seconds longer than casual observation required. The female, he said, conversational, almost offhand. The mother, German Shepherd, working line, sable and tan. 3 to 4 years old, I would estimate. Silence opened between them. Jess had not described Willow to anyone outside the cabin. Not the coloring, not the build, not the age. Occupational familiarity, Howe added quickly. He tapped the clipboard. I know my breeds. But knowing breeds meant distinguishing a shepherd from a Labrador. What Howe had done was describe a specific animal with the accuracy of someone who had seen her before or knew precisely what he was searching for. Return with documentation, Jess repeated, half a register lower. Final answer. Howe studied her. The smile held, but something behind it recalculated. He tucked the clipboard and turned toward his truck. I will be in touch, he said over his shoulder, and next time I will bring the appropriate order. He said appropriate the way certain men say reasonable, as a warning wearing the costume of cooperation. Jess watched his truck vanish into drizzle. She stood on the porch a full minute after arms crossed, replaying the conversation the way you replay a phone call in which something was said that sounded normal at the time but feels wrong the moment you hang up. She could not identify the exact fracture, but she could feel it, the way you feel a crack in a bone before the X-ray confirms it. He had known the dog, not the category, not the general type, the specific dog, and that knowledge had arrived in his mouth too easily, too precisely, to be the product of professional guesswork. Inside, Coda stood at the window where Howe's truck had been, ears forward, nostrils working the air beneath the door. He held position 30 seconds after the engine faded, cataloging the scent with the same methodical intensity he brought to every new variable in his environment, filing it permanently. The way he filed the scent of explosives, the way he filed the scent of fear. That evening, Nolan Prewitt walked the last 100 yards from the access road on foot, which told Jess something about his character before he opened his mouth. A man who parks far away and walks in is a man who understands that some spaces deserve to be approached rather than arrived at. Late 30s, sandy hair that fell across his forehead, permanent stubble that aged him past his years, handheld camera and folded tripod under one arm. He had built a modest career documenting coastal communities preferring stories that lingered over stories that flared, and the patience behind that preference was not naivety, but a deliberate choice to wait for the version of truth that only reveals itself to people who do not rush. Jess met him at the porch. No faces, no names. Tell it about the dogs, the shelter, what this town can do. Not the man inside. Nolan lowered the camera. I do not need a hero. I need a story worth telling quietly. She studied him, weighed him, found the weight acceptable. Film the fire, the pups, the hill, nothing else. He kept the agreement. The fever broke on the 4th afternoon. Colton opened his eyes to a ceiling he did not recognize. Then the smell of wood smoke reached him, and behind it the smell of fur, and his body remembered where it was before his mind agreed. Coda's head lifted. One tail thump. Restrained but real. Easy, Jess said from the bedside chair. You are home. He blinked at the word as if it were written in a language he had studied once and mostly lost. Pups, he managed. Alive. Bravo tried to eat a boot. Ember has not left your hallway in 8 hours. He exhaled something that wanted to be laughter, but settled for survival. By evening, he moved through the cabin in measured steps. Coda matched his pace to Colton's limp without instruction. The moment Colton entered the living room, Ember materialized at his boot chin, on the toe eyes delivering a message that required no translation. I waited. I am staying. Both are final. Dot arrived at dusk carrying broth and her worn Bible. Not for preaching. She had carried it through hospital corridors for 31 years the way others carry photographs, as proof that something larger than the present moment existed without needing to explain itself. She settled by the fire. Willow slept with Bravo against her side. Ember stayed fused to Colton's foot. Coda lay at the center of them all, breathing in a rhythm so steady it seemed to regulate everything around him. Silence filled the cabin. Not hollow silence. The kind that accumulates warmth, the way snow accumulates on branches invisibly until the branch bends under weight it never felt arriving. Dot entered the silence with the care of someone who has spent decades walking into rooms where gravity has already gathered. She did not break it. She joined it. Walter used to sit exactly like that, she said. Her voice was careful, measured the way medication is measured. My husband, after a bad call. He would sit by any fire he could find and hold himself so rigid I thought his spine would crack. If I asked what happened, he said nothing. He meant it as an order. She looked into the fire rather than at Colton, giving him the privacy of being spoken to without being watched. I learned not to ask what happened. I learned to sit in the room and not leave. Most nights that was enough. Colton did not speak. His breathing shifted 1 degree deeper. Dot noticed. 31 years of monitoring breath had made the observation automatic. He died on a Tuesday. Warehouse fire. The roof collapsed. 3 went in. 1 walked out. Walter did not walk out. Her hands folded in her lap. Still. The hands of a woman who had long ago made peace with stillness because the alternative was a restlessness that would never find what it sought. People told me to be strong, as if strong is a coat you pull from a closet, as if grief is weather that passes if you stand in it without flinching. She shook her head. Firelight caught the silver in her hair and turned it gold for 1 breath before returning it to silver. I know what it costs when people tell you to be strong and have no idea how exhausting strong can be. The room held, and Colton spoke, not because he chose to. The fever had stripped something away over 4 days, some interior wall that discipline maintained the way he maintained door latches and perimeter checks, and in its absence, the words came through the gap the way Ember had come through the gap in the back door. Not forced, inevitable. Lost a man, he said, eyes fixed past the fire in the middle distance where memory lives. Could have reached him. Did not move fast enough. The words arrived without performance. Bare, and smaller than he expected now that they were in the air. And more dangerous. Because small things are what people pick up and carry, and this one had been carried so long, it had worn grooves into places he could not see. Since then, I do not stay places. Low, steady, the cadence of a field report delivered to a room with no commanding officer and no mission and no reason to speak, except that the walls had come down far enough for truth to walk out on its own. Do not keep things. Do not hold on. Feels like I do not get to. His jaw tightened. The containment reflex. But the words were in the room, now breathing alongside the dogs and the fire and the silence. Jess stood in the kitchen doorway. She had stopped moving when he began and had not resumed. She let the quiet settle the way you let disturbed water clear. Home is not the place you deserve, she said. Quiet, firm. The authority of a woman who had rebuilt her life from wreckage and knew the difference between truth that heals and comfort that delays. It is the place that stays when you are at your worst. She held his gaze. You did not fail on that hill. You went back into the storm. You went back for her. Dot nodded once, hands folded, eyes kind. Grace is not earned, Colton, she said, and her voice carried 11 years of learning to accept the thing she was now offering. It is received. You do not get to decide you are unworthy of it any more than you get to decide whether the sun rises. He said nothing, but something in his shoulders released 1/fraction of a degree. A breath went half an inch deeper, as if the weight had not been removed but redistributed just enough to let his lungs reach space they had not touched in years. The fire cracked. Embers stirred. Coda's ears tilted once and resettled, calibrating to the new emotional pressure in the room with the same precision he used for barometric changes. That fellow Howe, she said. She handed the mug to Colton. Her eyes held him over the rim. There is a property north of town, old farmland, shuttered for years. People here do not go near it. Nobody says exactly why, but dogs have been turning up on the roadside in that direction for as long as I can remember. Not wild dogs. Dogs that look like they belonged to someone who decided they were done. She set the thermos down. Willow is not the first, and I do not believe she found that culvert by accident. Colton drank, said nothing. His face gave away nothing, but his gaze moved to Willow, asleep by the fire, then to the ridge of old scar on her shoulder, then to the band of thinned fur around her neck, where something had been fastened too tight for too long, then to Ember, warm, breathing against his boot with the rhythm of a creature that had decided where she belonged. 3 details: a scar, a collar mark, a county official who described a dog he should not have been able to describe. 3 threads that did not yet form a picture, but confirmed that a picture existed and that someone was working to ensure it never came into focus. Outside, rain continued against the roof. Inside, the fire burned low, and the cabin held warmth and silence, and a population of lives that had not existed within these walls 1 week ago. And Colton sat in the center of it, with a mug cooling in his bandaged hands, and a thought forming in his chest that frightened him more than any firefight or night operation or the memory of a hand falling through desert air. He did not want to leave. The thought arrived without permission, without tactical qualification, without any of the careful framing he normally applied to emotions before allowing them to breathe. It was simple and enormous, and it sat in the center of him, like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward through every defense he had constructed across 4 years of constant motion. He did not want to leave, and for a man whose entire method of survival was built on the single principle that leaving before attachment deepened was the only reliable way to prevent loss, that thought was the most dangerous thing in the room. More dangerous than the storm. More dangerous than the man in the county truck who knew too much. More dangerous than the hand that fell through desert air in a memory that never stopped playing. Because this thought asked him to stay, and staying meant that everything he had spent 4 years outrunning would finally, inevitably, and permanently know where to find him. Spring did not arrive in Astoria so much as negotiate its way in. Light came in thin increments, softening the gray by degrees, thinning the salt wind until it carried warmth rather than punishment. The pines on the ridge above the cabin straightened slowly, shedding the permanent lean that winter storms had pressed into their trunks, and the ocean below shifted from the color of iron to something closer to slate, which in Astoria counted as optimism. Willow's ribs no longer showed beneath her coat. The dull wariness that had lived in her eyes since the culvert had been replaced by a steady intelligence, the gaze of a dog who had decided that the world might be worth watching rather than merely surviving. She moved across the yard with renewed strength, tail lifting in measured arcs instead of hanging low in surrender. When Bravo tumbled past her, chasing a shadow that turned out to be a leaf that turned out to be nothing. She corrected him with a nudge of her muzzle that was firm without being harsh, and the correction held in a way that suggested she was remembering how to be a mother rather than just a guardian. Bravo had grown into his boldness. He chased gull shadows across the grass with a fearlessness that bordered on comedy and occasionally on structural damage, having already cost the porch railing one spindle and Colton's spare boot a lace. Ember remained his opposite in every measurable way. She watched first, calculated second, moved third. Her steps were no longer trembling, but they were never reckless, and there was a quality to her attention that reminded Colton of the best soldiers he had served with. Not the loudest ones, the ones who noticed things before anyone else and said nothing until the information mattered. She still followed him everywhere, boot to hearth, to porch, to yard, and he had stopped pretending it bothered him. Coda remained the axis around which every creature in the household turned. His posture had shifted over the weeks from combat readiness to what Colton recognized as relaxed alertness, the state a working dog enters when the environment has been assessed and classified as stable but not guaranteed. He corrected Bravo's overenthusiasm with a single well-timed nudge. He gave Willow space without ceding authority. He moved through the yard and the cabin with the quiet certainty of a dog who understood that his job was no longer to detect threats, but to maintain the conditions under which threats could not take root. On a Tuesday morning that smelled like wet pine and the first honest sunlight in months, Colton stood on the porch with his sleeves rolled to his forearms and watched the dogs move across the grass. The lines in his face had not disappeared, but they had softened, as if the tension that carved them had loosened its grip just enough to let the skin remember it was allowed to rest. Nolan's video had gone out 4 days earlier. No faces, no names, just footage of the ravine, the repaired culvert, the fire-lit cabin where 3 dogs had huddled against the worst storm in a decade. His voiceover was steady, almost reverent, and the piece ended with a single line about community and the choices that define it. Within 48 hours, the response had exceeded anything Nolan or Jess had anticipated. Messages arrived at the shelter, offers of lumber, fencing, insulation, volunteer hours, small checks folded into handwritten envelopes that smelled of kitchen counters and good intentions. Astoria, a town that had weathered economic decline and coastal erosion with the stubbornness of a place that refused to be defined by what it had lost, responded with quiet resolve rather than spectacle. Jess organized the volunteers with the same efficiency she brought to every crisis that crossed her path. Clipboard under one arm, auburn hair pulled back, freckles warmed by sun instead of rain. She moved through the preliminary plans for a proper rescue facility with firm encouragement, assigning tasks and redirecting effort without ever raising her voice. Her authority came from example, from years of hauling feed bags and cleaning kennels without complaint, and never once asking anyone to do what she would not do first. The land just below the cabin, once a neglected patch of scrub and mud that sloped toward the Pacific, had been identified as the site. Colton had said nothing when Jess first proposed it. He had not agreed. He had not refused. He had simply gone silent in the particular way that Jess had learned to interpret as the sound of a man processing something he was not yet ready to accept or reject. But then the lumber arrived. And Boyd Strickland, a broad-shouldered carpenter who had lost a cousin overseas and carried a quiet respect for service that did not require conversation, showed up with his crew and began measuring the ground. And Colton, without announcement or explanation, walked down the hill and picked up the other end of the first beam. He worked at the edges, lifting, checking alignments, reinforcing joints where wind would test them hardest. His movements were efficient and spare the same economy of motion he applied to everything. He did not give speeches. He did not stand at the center, but the distance he maintained between himself and the others shortened by inches each day, and the shortening was visible to anyone paying attention. That was when Howe came back. He arrived in the same county truck, same clipboard, same smile that measured distances rather than expressed warmth. But this time, he carried a manila folder held against his chest like a holstered sidearm visible enough to announce intent. He parked at the edge of the access road and walked toward the construction site with the deliberate pace of someone who knows that urgency diminishes authority and patience amplifies it. Jess saw him first. She set down her clipboard and moved to intercept, positioning herself between Howe and the emerging frame of the building. Same instinct, same stance, same woman who had blocked the cabin door weeks earlier. Mr. Howe. Miss Whitford. The smile, the nod, the courtesy that functioned as camouflage. I see progress is being made. Admirable community effort. His gaze swept the site, the volunteers, the dogs in the yard above, and then it settled on the manila folder in his own hands, as if he had just remembered he was holding it. I have a formal notice, he said. 72-hour compliance window. The facility you are constructing does not currently meet county health and safety requirements. The animals on this property remain unregistered and without complete vaccination documentation. And the shelter operating license filed under your name has not been approved. He opened the folder and extended a single sheet of paper toward Jess. His fingers were steady. His voice was level. And the words on the page carried the specific weight of bureaucratic language designed to sound reasonable while describing consequences that were not. 72 hours to achieve full compliance, he continued. Failing that, the county reserves the right to seize all unregistered animals on the premises and suspend construction pending a full review. Jess took the paper, read it. Her jaw tightened, but her voice did not rise. This is a construction site, less than 2 weeks old. You are holding us to completion standards before the foundation is finished. I am holding you to the standards that apply, Howe replied, equally and without exception. Behind them on the hill, Colton had stopped working. He stood with a beam resting against his shoulder, watching Howe with the flat assessment he reserved for figures whose authority felt manufactured rather than earned. Coda had positioned himself at the edge of the yard body, angled toward the access road ears, tracking the conversation below with the same focus he brought to the detection of explosives. Howe glanced up the hill. His eyes found Colton. Held for 2 seconds, then returned to Jess. 72 hours, he repeated, and he turned and walked back to his truck without waiting for a response. That evening, in the back room of the shelter where Jess kept her records, Nolan spread 3 documents across a folding table and looked at her with an expression that had traveled from curiosity through confusion and arrived at something closer to alarm. I traced the microchip, he said. He had been working on Willow's history quietly and methodically since the night he first filmed her by the fire. It began with the old microchip that a volunteer veterinarian had scanned during a routine checkup 2 weeks earlier. The chip was registered. Outdated, but registered. And the registration led to a name, and the name led to a property, and the property led to a place that Nolan had driven past 3 times before locating the access road because the entrance had been designed by someone who did not want it found. He had almost dismissed it the first time. A shuttered kennel. Abandoned paperwork. The kind of dead end that rural investigations produce more often than revelations. But something had nagged at him. A detail that did not fit. The chip was outdated, but it had never been deactivated. Whoever registered Willow had stopped updating her records, but had not bothered to remove her from the system entirely, which meant either carelessness or the particular arrogance of someone who believed no one would ever look. The chip is registered to a kennel operation on a property 12 miles north of town, he said. It has been officially inactive for 3 years, but the power bill is current. The water bill is current, and the property tax is paid through a trust that lists a post office box in Astoria as its mailing address. He pushed a printout toward Jess. County property records. The trust name meant nothing, but the registered agent listed on the formation documents was a name they both recognized. Jess stared at it for a long time without speaking. Jess pressed her knuckles against the table. How long? The chip registration dates back 5 years. The property has been officially closed for 3. But everything is still running. Power. Water. Someone is maintaining it. And nobody checked. Nobody had a reason to look until now. The property north of town sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off the coastal highway where the forest thickened and the land rose toward hills that blocked the ocean from view. Nolan had photographed the exterior from the public road, chain link fencing topped with angled wire. A padlocked gate, 2 low metal buildings behind a wall of overgrown blackberry bushes that had been allowed to grow tall enough to function as a screen. No signage, no visible activity. But the gravel in front of the gate was pressed flat by tire tracks that were recent and regular, and the padlock was new, its steel bright against the rusted chain it secured. "Dogs go in," Nolan said, laying photographs on the table beside the microchip records. "They get used until they are not useful. Then they get driven somewhere remote and released. No chip removal because removing a chip leaves a scar that raises questions. Easier to just dump the animal and hope the elements do the rest." He paused, looked at Jess, then at Colton, who had entered the room without announcement, and now stood against the far wall with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Willow was dumped because she was pregnant," Nolan continued. "A pregnant dog cannot work, cannot breed on schedule, cannot be sold. She became a liability. So someone drove her out to the forest road above the culvert and left her there, in a storm, knowing what the storm would do." The room was quiet except for the sound of Coda breathing near the doorway. Jess picked up the property registration document again, read the name of the registered agent again, set it down. "How?" she said. Nolan nodded. "The trust that owns the property lists a registered agent. The agent is a relative. Same last name. Same mailing address Howe uses for his county correspondence. He is not just enforcing regulations. He is protecting an operation. And the 72-hour notice is not about compliance. It is about getting Willow off this property before someone connects her chip to that kennel and connects that kennel to him. Colton spoke from the far wall. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which in Colton meant the opposite of calm. He knew her breed, her age, her coloring. First day he showed up. Yes, Nolan said, because she was his. Because she was his inventory, and he wants her back before she becomes his evidence. The information filled the room, slowly, completely, displacing everything that had occupied the space before it, like water rising in a sealed chamber. Everything Howe had done since the first afternoon he knocked on the cabin door rearranged itself in Colton's mind. The smile that never reached his eyes. The description of a dog he should not have been able to describe. The bureaucratic precision that felt less like procedure and more like a controlled demolition designed to remove evidence before anyone understood what they were looking at. Howe was not an overzealous official. He was a man standing in front of a door he needed to keep closed, and every polite sentence he had spoken was a lock he was trying to turn before someone found the key. Colton's jaw tightened, not in anger, in recognition. He had spent his career reading environments for concealed threats, and the sickness he felt was not outrage, but the cold professional clarity of a man who had identified a hostile operator and was now calculating the distance between identification and action. Willow had not wandered into that culvert by accident. She had been placed in the path of a storm by someone who understood that storms erase evidence more efficiently than any human effort. And the two puppies clinging to the metal lip of that pipe, the two small lives he had pulled from freezing water with bleeding hands, were not casualties of weather. They were casualties of a man who had decided that a pregnant dog was worth less than the cost of feeding her. He looked at the photographs of the property, the chain link, the wire, the buildings designed to contain without comfort. Then he looked at the doorway where Coda sat, and beyond Coda to the living room where Ember slept near the hearth with her chin on her paws, and her breath rising and falling in the rhythm of an animal that had finally learned it was safe to sleep without guarding against the next disaster. The parallel was not subtle, and he did not try to avoid it. Willow had been used and discarded by a system that valued function over life, bred until she could not breed profitably, worked until she could not work conveniently. And when she became an inconvenience, when her body did what bodies do and created life at a moment that did not align with someone else's schedule, she was driven to a remote road and abandoned to a storm that was expected to solve the problem permanently. Colton knew that arithmetic. He had lived inside it. He had been the instrument of a system that valued mission completion above the men who bled to complete the missions. And when the bleeding did not stop after the mission ended, when the nightmares and the flashbacks and the inability to hold a conversation without scanning every exit in the room became inconvenient to the machinery of normal life, he had been processed out with paperwork and a handshake and left to find his own culvert to drown in. Different uniforms, different chains. The same cold calculation that reduced living things to line items on a ledger and crossed them off when the cost of maintenance exceeded the projected return. And the man who had done the discarding was now standing in a county jacket with a clipboard and a 72-hour deadline, smiling his careful smile, trying to clean up the evidence of his indifference before the world noticed it existed and called it by its real name. "What do we do?" Jess asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. They rested on the table with a tension that showed in the tendons along her wrists. Colton looked at her. How many dogs did you say have shown up on the roadside over the years? Jess glanced at the documents. Dot mentioned it has been going on for years. Nobody kept count. Somebody should have. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at Nolan, then at Jess, then at the photographs one more time. 72 hours, he said. His voice carried no anger, no heat, just the flat operational calm of a man who had spent 2 decades entering situations where the odds were calculated against him and had learned that emotion was a luxury that came after the mission, never during. Then we use every one of them. Outside the room, Coda lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the access road where the sound of a distant engine had appeared and then faded. He held position for 10 seconds, then settled, but his eyes did not close, and his nostrils continued to work the air that drifted beneath the door, reading the night for the particular scent he had cataloged weeks earlier and had not forgotten. The scent of a man who smiled without warmth and carried authority like a weapon and drove a truck that was too clean for a town built on salt and rain. Coda did not understand human language. He did not know the word evidence or the word justice or the word 72 hours, but he understood threat. He understood concealment. And he understood with the absolute certainty of an animal whose senses had been sharpened across generations of breeding and years of operational deployment that the man who had stood on the porch and spoken in measured pleasant tones was not what he presented himself to be. And he understood in the way that only a creature who has spent its entire life reading the body of the person beside it can understand that his partner had just made a decision. The kind of decision that changed the scent of a man's skin. The kind that straightened posture and slowed breathing and shifted weight forward onto the balls of the feet. The kind that Coda had detected hundreds of times before in rooms and vehicles and landing zones across continents. And that always meant the same thing. We are no longer waiting. We are moving towards something, and we are not coming back until it is done. In the cabin above, the fire had burned to embers. Willow lay with Bravo curled against her. Ember slept near the doorway of the bedroom where Colton's scent was strongest, her small body curled tight with her nose tucked beneath one paw. Rising and falling with the peace of a creature that did not yet know that the ground beneath her safety was about to shift again. And on the access road below the property, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, Garrett Howe's truck sat with its engine off and its headlights dark. He had not gone home after delivering the 72-hour notice. He had driven half a mile down the highway, pulled into a logging turnout, waited 20 minutes, and then circled back along the ridge road that offered a partial view of the cabin through a gap in the pines. He sat behind the wheel with his hands on his thighs and his jaw grinding through calculations that produced no answers he wanted to hear. The lights of the cabin glowed faintly through the trees. He could see shapes moving behind the curtains. He could see the outline of the construction site below the pale skeleton of new framing that had not existed a month ago, and that represented to him not community generosity, but the slow tightening of a net around something he had kept hidden for years. He watched the cabin and thought about fire, not the kind that warms, the kind that starts in a wall you cannot see, and spreads until the structure is gone, calculating how much time remained on a board, shrinking with every hour before the pieces he had spent years keeping separate finally assembled themselves into a picture that would end everything he had built his careful silence to protect. The 72 hours began their countdown in silence. No ceremony. Just the steady subtraction of minutes from a total that already felt insufficient. By the second morning, 3 volunteers had withdrawn. They left quietly with apologetic phone calls to Jess that used phrases like legal exposure and family to think about, and maybe after this, all settles down. She listened to each one without argument, thanked them for their time, set the phone down gently each time, and then stood very still in the shelter office for 10 or 15 seconds before picking up her clipboard and returning to the list of things that still needed to be done, which had not gotten shorter. Boyd Strickland stayed. He arrived at dawn with sawdust in his beard and 2 thermoses of coffee and said nothing about the volunteers who had left because Boyd had learned from his cousin's death that the people who stay do not require an explanation for why the people who leave have gone. He simply measured the next section of framing and began cutting. Dot stayed. She worked the phone from the folding table near the construction site, glasses slipping down her nose, handwriting careful and precise in the margins of a yellow legal pad. She was calling every contact she had accumulated across 31 years of nursing and 11 years of dispatch work, which was a considerable number, and she was calling them not with panic, but with the calm, specific requests of a woman who understood that communities respond to clarity faster than they respond to desperation. But the math was not kind. The shelter lacked completed fencing on 2 sides. The veterinary documentation for Willow and the pups was incomplete because the volunteer vet could not return until Thursday, which was 6 hours past the deadline. The operating license application sat in a county office that Howe's position gave him influence over, which meant approval could be delayed indefinitely without anyone being able to prove the delay was deliberate. Jess knew this. She had spent 6 years fighting systems that were designed to exhaust the people who challenged them, and she recognized the architecture of what Howe had built. It was not a wall, it was a maze, and the maze was designed so that every path that looked like progress led back to a door that only he could open. She stood in the half-finished shelter at midday, surrounded by the smell of fresh pine and wet concrete, and for the first time since her brother's death, she felt the particular fatigue that comes not from physical effort, but from the suspicion that effort might not be enough. She did not say any of this aloud, but Colton saw it. He saw it in the way her shoulders dropped half an inch when she thought no one was watching, in the way she read the 72-hour notice for the 4th time, as if hoping the words had rearranged themselves into something less absolute, in the way she set the paper down and pressed both hands flat against the table and breathed with a control that was not calm, but the active prevention of collapse. He recognized the posture. He had worn it himself in rooms where the mission parameters had changed and the resources had not, and the distance between what was required and what was possible had opened into a gap that no amount of discipline could bridge. And he recognized what came next. Because it was the same thing that always came next for him. The urge to leave. It arrived on schedule. Familiar as a weapon cleaned 1,000 times. The voice in his survival architecture that said, "This is how it goes. You get close, things break, you leave before the breaking touches you." The protocol that had kept him alive and alone and moving for 4 years across rented rooms and borrowed time, and the geography of a man who had decided that staying anywhere cost more than perpetual departure. He began packing that evening, not dramatically, not with announcement. He simply moved through the cabin with the efficiency of a man who had reduced his belongings to what fit in a single duffel, which was everything he owned, which was almost nothing. He folded the thermal shirt, rolled the spare uniform, checked the truck's fuel gauge through the window, and then he stood in the living room with a duffel on his shoulder and looked at Coda and said the word that had started every departure for 4 years. Load up. Coda did not move. He sat in the center of the room between the hearth and the hallway, positioned exactly where he had positioned himself every night since they arrived. His amber brown eyes were fixed on Colton with an attention that was not confusion and was not defiance. It was something more precise than either. It was assessment. The same look he gave when Colton issued a command that conflicted with environmental data the dog had already processed and concluded was more reliable than the instruction. Coda had never refused a direct order, not in training, not in the field, not in the years since they left service together. He operated on a foundation of trust that was absolute and mutual, and within that foundation was the understanding that obedience was not submission, but partnership. And that partnership included the right to signal when the partner was wrong. He was signaling now. He sat with his weight settled and his paws planted and his ears forward and his gaze locked on the man who had taught him everything he knew about the world, except the one thing the man had never learned about himself. That leaving was not the same as surviving. That motion was not the same as safety. That the thing he was running from was not behind him, but inside him, and no road in any direction would ever increase the distance. Colton stared at the dog. The dog stared back. The fire crackled. Ember appeared at the bedroom doorway and looked at Colton with her head tilted and her small body very still, and the look on her face was not the panic of abandonment, but the quiet question of a creature who had already decided where she belonged and was waiting to see if the man she had chosen would make the same decision. The duffel sat on his shoulder like a weight he had carried so long. He had forgotten it was optional. His hand moved to his chest pocket. The dog tag. The one he had touched 100 times without looking at. The one that pressed against his heartbeat like a second pulse, cold and metallic and constant. He pulled it out, held it in his palm, and for the first time in 4 years, he turned it over and read the name stamped into the steel. His own name, Colton Briggs. Not the name of the man who fell. His own identification. The tag he had kept from the day he was processed out of the Navy, because on that day, the man whose name it carried had ceased to exist. The man who believed in missions and purpose, and the possibility that discipline could build something worth defending, had died on a helicopter floor in a desert, and what walked away was not Colton Briggs, but the echo of him. A shape that breathed and scanned perimeters and maintained the rituals of a life that no longer had a life inside it. He stared at the name. His hand did not shake this time. The tremor that had lived in his fingers since the night he pulled Ember from the thorn bushes was absent, replaced by a stillness that felt less like numbness and more like clarity. He closed his fist around the tag, looked at Coda, looked at Ember, looked at the door that led outside to the truck and the road, and the old familiar nowhere that was waiting for him the way it always waited. Then he set the duffel on the floor. "All right," he said. His voice was low and rough and carried no bravado and no performance. Just the sound of a man who had run out of road and discovered that the place where the road ended was the place he was supposed to have been standing all along. "We stay?" Coda's tail moved once, a single controlled sweep across the wooden floor. The canine equivalent of a nod. And Colton turned away from the door and sat down on the floor beside the hearth, where Ember was already waiting, and Coda was already settling, and the fire was already burning with the steady patience of something that had never once considered going out. He did not sleep that night. He planned. The planning was not emotional. It was operational. He sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper and mapped the problem like an insertion route. Target evidence. Method documentation. Timeline approximately 41 hours remaining. Nolan arrived before midnight. Jess had called him. He came through the door carrying a camera bag with 2 memory cards and a battery pack, and the expression of a man who understood that the story he had been telling quietly was about to become the kind of story that made noise. Colton laid out the approach in sentences that were short and direct and carried the particular efficiency of someone who had briefed operations in rooms where brevity was not a stylistic choice, but a survival requirement. We go to the property. We document what is there. We do not enter. We do not trespass. We record what is visible from the public road and from any access point that is not gated or posted. Nolan handles camera. I handle route and security. Coda handles perimeter. He looked at Nolan. You understand that if we find what I think we find, this stops being a community interest piece. Nolan held his gaze. I understand. They left the cabin at 2 a.m. The drive north took 20 minutes on roads that Colton navigated without headlights for the final mile, using moonlight and spatial awareness that does not disappear when the uniform is removed. Coda rode in the back with his head angled toward the open window, sampling the air in methodical intervals. As the landscape changed from coastal pine to interior farmland to the smell of a place where animals were kept in numbers the land was never designed to support. They parked 200 yards from the entrance on a dirt pull-off screened by Douglas fir. Colton stepped out first. Boots on gravel. Breath controlled. Coda dropped beside him and began working the air nose high, then low moving in the quiet, purposeful way that meant he had detected something worth investigating. The property was visible through gaps in the overgrown blackberry that lined the fence. Nolan positioned himself at the edge of the public road where the fence met a drainage easement that provided a clear sight line to the nearest metal building. He raised the camera, adjusted the low light settings, and began recording. What the lens captured in the next 11 minutes would change everything. Through the gaps in the fence and the partially open doors of the nearest building, the camera recorded rows of wire kennels stacked in configurations that maximized quantity and eliminated comfort. Dogs visible in several of the enclosures, their shapes thin and still in the way that animals become still when stillness is the only energy expenditure they can afford. Water bowls empty or overturned. No bedding. No ventilation beyond the gaps in the corrugated metal walls where rust had eaten through. Colton did not watch through the camera. He watched the perimeter. His eyes moved in the patterns that 20 years of training had carved into his nervous system. Fence line, road, tree line, gate, back to fence line. His body was still, but his awareness was not. And beside him, Coda maintained a parallel surveillance nose, working the wind for any human scent that did not belong to the 3 of them. Nolan recorded the kennels, the fence, the tire tracks, the new padlock on the rusted chain, the utility meter on the side of the building that was spinning with a current that confirmed active electrical use in a facility that was supposed to have been closed for 3 years. He recorded it all with the steady hands of a man who had learned that a camera does not need to shout when the image it captures is loud enough on its own. At the 12-minute mark, Coda's posture changed. The shift was subtle, a tightening along the shoulders, ears rotating 15 degrees east, weight moving forward onto his front paws. Colton recognized the signal before the dog completed it. Someone was approaching. Vehicle, still distant but closing. "Time," Colton said. One word. No volume. Nolan lowered the camera, secured the lens cap. They moved back to the truck through the tree line rather than the road, Coda leading the withdrawal with the same quiet professionalism he had brought to the approach. Within 90 seconds, they were in the vehicle and moving south with headlights still off and the gravel whispering beneath the tires. Behind them, headlights appeared at the far end of the property road. A vehicle pulling into the gate. Colton watched it in the mirror without slowing down and without speeding up and without any visible reaction at all. The next 18 hours moved with the momentum of a machine that has been assembled from separate parts across weeks of preparation and now operates as a single mechanism. Nolan worked through the night. He assembled the footage into a sequence that was factual and unhurried and devastating in its restraint. No dramatic music, no accusatory narration, just images, kennels, dogs, empty water bowls, utility records, property documents, microchip registration, and the name that connected all of it to a man in a county jacket who smiled with a politeness that now looked like concealment. Dot made phone calls. The Regional Animal Welfare Office in Salem. A reporter at the Astoria newspaper who owed her a favor. The county commissioner's office. Each call was brief and specific and carried the authority of a woman who had spent decades being underestimated and had made that underestimation work for her. She did this from the folding table near the construction site, glasses on legal pad filling with names. Jess mobilized the community, not with speeches, with phone calls and text messages and the simple direct request that had always been her most effective tool. Show up tomorrow morning. Bring yourself. That is enough. Boyd Strickland called 6 people. Each of those 6 called 4 more. By midnight, the word had traveled through Astoria the way information travels through small towns, not through broadcasts, but through the accumulation of individual conversations that weave together into a net that is stronger than any single thread. When Howe arrived at the property at 9 in the morning on the final day of the 72-hour window, he found something he had not anticipated. The access road to the shelter was lined with vehicles. Not dozens, but enough. Pickup trucks and sedans and one boat trailer that someone had driven over from the marina because they did not have time to unhitch it. Volunteers stood in the yard and along the fence line. Boyd Strickland and his crew. Fishermen who had left their boats at dock. High school students who had skipped first period. Older women who had brought coffee in thermoses and folding chairs, and the particular expression of people who have decided to be present and are not interested in being asked to leave. Nolan stood near the gate with his camera on a tripod. The red recording light was visible from the road. Howe parked. He sat in his truck for a long moment, longer than a confident man would need. Then he stepped out with his clipboard and his jacket and his smile and walked toward the entrance. Jess met him at the property line. Behind her, Colton stood with Coda at his side. He did not step forward. He did not need to. His presence communicated what it had always communicated. Stillness that was not passivity. Calm that was not weakness. The posture of a man who had made a decision and was now simply occupying the space that the decision required. "Mr. Howe," Jess said, "before you proceed with your inspection, I want to inform you that the footage and documentation collected from the property registered to the Howe Family Trust on Route 26 North has been submitted to the Regional Animal Welfare Authority in Salem, to the County Commissioner's Office, and to the Astoria Daily News. A formal complaint has been filed. Howe's smile held for 3 seconds after she finished speaking. Then it did not. The expression that replaced it was not anger. It was the stillness of a man who has been calculating odds for weeks and has just realized that the calculation no longer matters, because the variable he failed to account for was a community that had decided collectively that the things happening 12 miles north in a building that was supposed to be closed were no longer acceptable. He looked at the camera, at the volunteers, at Colton and Coda, at the shelter taking shape behind them on the hillside, its pale pine frame standing against the sky like the skeleton of something that intended to grow. He did not speak. He looked at the camera once more. He returned to his truck and drove away. He did not return. The county sheriff's office arrived 4 hours later. 2 officers. They carried a warrant for inspection of the property on Route 26 North. By evening, the property was sealed. By the following morning, 11 dogs had been removed from the kennels and transported to emergency veterinary care in Seaside. By this end of the week, Garrett Howe had been suspended from his position pending investigation. The 72-hour compliance notice was rescinded. The dogs from the property arrived at the shelter over the following days. Thin, quiet. Some with the same worn collar marks that Willow carried on her neck. Jess processed each one with bandages and formula, and the particular gentleness of a woman who had been doing this work long enough to know that the first thing a rescued animal needs is not food or medicine, but the experience of being touched by hands that do not intend to hurt. Colton helped, without announcement, without being asked. He carried kennels and hauled water and checked fencing and moved through the shelter with the same efficient economy he brought to everything. And if anyone noticed that he was no longer working at the edges but at the center, they did not comment on it, because some changes are better honored by silence than by applause. That night, he sat on the cabin porch with Coda beside him and Ember curled on his lap. The Pacific stretched dark and infinite below the cliff. Stars showed through breaks in the clouds for the first time in what felt like months. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, held it in the moonlight, read the name one more time. Then he turned it over in his fingers slowly. A man rehearsing an unfamiliar gesture, preparing to set something down that he had carried so long he had forgotten his hand could open. Not discard, not destroy. Set down, in a place where it can rest without being forgotten and without being carried any further than it has already been carried. Maybe it is time, he said, not to Coda, not to Ember, to the name on the tag and the man it belonged to, and the ghost of the soldier who had lived inside that name, and had died in a desert and had been walking around inside Colton's body, ever since refusing to lie down. Maybe it is time to let you rest. He did not set the tag down that night. Not yet. But the way he held it had changed. Loosely. As if his hand was practicing for the moment when it would finally open and allow the metal to find a surface that was not his skin. Coda leaned against his leg. Ember breathed against his chest. And the ocean moved below them in the darkness with the patient rhythm of something that had been waiting a very long time for the man on the cliff to stop running and start listening to what the water had been trying to tell him all along. That rest is not the same as giving up, and staying is not the same as surrender. And sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is put down his weapon, open his hands, and build something worth defending with them instead. The marina at Astoria sat at the mouth of the Columbia River where fresh water met salt and the fishing boats rocked in a rhythm that had not changed in 100 years. It was early morning. Fog clung to the surface of the water in thin, pale sheets that the sun had not yet burned away. The air smelled of diesel and brine and the particular cold that rises from deep water even in spring. Colton had come to pick up fencing supplies donated by a fisherman named Grady from a decommissioned crab operation. The supplies were stacked near the fuel dock, and the errand was simple, the kind of task that asked nothing of the mind. Coda walked beside him on the dock, posture relaxed but present, nose sampling the harbor air with the casual thoroughness of a dog who never fully stopped working even in peace. Gulls circled overhead, arguing about territory in the shrill, persistent language of birds that have never learned diplomacy. Colton saw Howe before Howe saw him. The man stood at the far end of the fuel dock, leaning against a piling with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that no longer carried the county insignia. He looked smaller without it, not physically. Something else had contracted. The architecture of authority that had structured his posture and his speech, and his carefully calibrated smile, had been removed, and what remained was the frame of a man standing alone on a dock in the early morning fog with nowhere in particular to be. Colton could have turned around. The fencing supplies were 30 yards to the right, and Howe was 40 yards straight ahead, and the geometry of avoidance was simple. He had spent 4 years perfecting the geometry of avoidance. He knew every angle. He walked forward instead, not aggressively, not with the squared shoulders of confrontation. He walked the way he walked everywhere, with the economical stride of a man whose body had been trained to move efficiently through hostile environments, except this environment was not hostile. It was a dock at dawn. And the man at the end of it was not a threat. He was what remains after the threat has been removed. An aftermath. Howe saw him when the distance closed to 20 feet. His body stiffened for a fraction of a second, the instinctive contraction of a man who has been caught in a place he did not expect to be observed. Then the stiffness passed, and what replaced it was not the old composure, but something rawer. Resignation, perhaps. Or the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding a mask in place for years and has just felt it pulled away. They stood 15 feet apart. The fog drifted between them. The boats creaked against their moorings. Coda sat at Colton's left side, calm, watchful ears forward, but body relaxed, reading the other man's state with the same precision he brought to everything. Howe spoke first. His voice was different without the clipboard and the jacket. Thinner, less measured. The voice of a man talking to another man rather than performing a role. "I did not start that way," he said. Colton did not respond. He waited. The way he had learned to wait in rooms where the person across from him had information that would come out faster without prompting than with it. "The kennel was my brother's idea. Breeding operation. Working dogs. Supposed to be legitimate." Howe looked at the water. "I came back from overseas and did not know what to do with my hands. You know that feeling. Your hands remember things civilian life does not need, and the silence is louder than any noise you heard over there." He paused. The dogs made sense, structure, something to maintain. But corners got cut. Then the corners disappeared, and it was a straight line between keeping the operation running and pretending the cost was acceptable. His jaw worked. You tell yourself the dogs are fine. You tell yourself you will fix it next month. Then next month becomes next year, and the thing you built to save yourself becomes the thing you cannot look at without seeing exactly what you have become. Colton listened. He did not nod. He did not offer understanding or absolution. He stood and he listened, and he let the man's words occupy the space between them without interference, the way you let a wound bleed before you decide whether it needs pressure or air. I knew what Willow was when I saw the report. Howe continued. I knew where she came from, and I knew that if anyone traced her back to that property, everything I had spent 9 years keeping quiet would come apart. He looked at Colton for the first time. I was not trying to hurt the dogs. I was trying to survive. The word sat between them. Survive. Colton knew its weight. He knew how it could be used to justify architecture that would horrify the man who built it if he ever stepped far enough outside to see it clearly. He knew because he had used the same word to justify 4 years of solitude and the systematic dismantling of every connection that might have required him to feel something other than the cold efficiency of forward movement. He did not forgive Howe. Forgiveness was not his to give. What had happened in those buildings was real and had been endured by creatures who could not speak and could not leave and could not do anything except wait for footsteps that might bring water or might bring nothing. But he understood the mechanism. The way a wound left untreated does not heal, but builds defenses that become indistinguishable from the person carrying them. War breaks people in different ways, Colton said. His voice was low, not gentle, not harsh, just accurate. And the way we put ourselves back together decides what we become. You and I started in the same place. We did not end up in the same place. He held Howe's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the fencing supplies without looking back. Coda fell into step beside him. The fog continued to drift across the water. The boats continued to creak. And Garrett Howe remained at the end of the dock alone, watching the man and the dog walk away, and whether what he felt was shame or relief or the beginning of something that did not yet have a name was a question that only he could answer and that Colton had no intention of asking. The opening of Willow Harbor Rescue happened on a Saturday in late April when the sun broke clean across the hillside and turned the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold that stretched from the cliff base to the horizon. The shelter stood completed on the slope below the cabin, pale pine framing, fenced enclosures catching sun and sea breeze, a central building designed for animals and people with a common room that smelled of fresh wood and held the warmth of a space built by hands that showed up because they chose to. Clara Dunning, the art teacher, had painted the sign by hand. 50s silver-streaked curls paint permanently beneath her fingernails. The letters in navy blue read, Willow Harbor Rescue, in a font that was clean and slightly imperfect in the way handmade things are, which is to say, alive, beneath community and veteran support. Jess had insisted healing should not be limited by species. Folding chairs lined the yard. Families gathered. Boyd Strickland stood near the fence with his crew arms crossed mustache hiding a smile. Dot sat at a table near the entrance with a guest book and a pen and the same wire-rimmed glasses and the same steady warmth she had brought to every interaction since the night she knocked on the cabin door with a thermos of ginger tea. 2 families had been pre-screened by Jess for adoption, The Pembertons' parents in their early 40s with twin boys who vibrated with contained excitement, and Russell Tate, a retired Coast Guard mechanic in his 60s, whose quiet demeanor and weathered hands and steady gaze suggested a man who had spent decades repairing things in rough conditions and understood that patience was not a virtue, but a skill. Colton positioned himself at the back of the gathering, hands clasped loosely behind him, intending to let Jess speak and remain unseen. He had agreed to the opening. He had not agreed to visibility. And as Nolan adjusted his camera discreetly near the fence, Colton felt the old instinct tighten in his chest. The pull toward shadow. The reflex that said observation is safety and exposure is risk, and the space between the two is measured in the number of people who know your face. Coda sensed the tension. He turned his head and looked up at Colton. Then, without command, he walked forward. Not dramatically. He crossed the yard with the unhurried certainty of a dog who knew where he was going and stopped beside Jess and sat down. Tall, composed, positioned not as prop, but as presence. Every eye in the gathering followed the line of the leash from the dog to the man at the back of the yard. There was a moment of collective recognition. Quiet, unannounced, the kind of awareness that settles over a group of people simultaneously like a shift in light that everyone notices but no one names. The story they had watched in Nolan's footage, the story of a culvert and a storm, and 3 dogs pulled from water by hands that bled had a face. And the face was standing at the edge of the crowd trying to decide whether to step forward or disappear. Colton felt the resistance tighten. Every year of solitude argued against exposure. Every mile of road he had driven to avoid this exact moment weighed against the few yards of grass between him and the place where Coda had decided he should be. He stepped forward, not because he wanted applause, not because he had overcome his fear. He stepped forward because the dog who had saved his life on a hillside in a storm, who had pressed a shoulder into his ribs when his mind was lost in a desert 7,000 miles away, who had refused to get in the truck when every instinct told Colton to run, had just walked to the front of a crowd and sat down, and that dog had never once in his life been wrong about where they needed to be. The applause that followed was not loud. It was sustained, a quiet, rhythmic clapping that sounded more like gratitude than celebration, the sound a community makes when it recognizes something it has been waiting to acknowledge. Jess gestured toward him briefly. Colton nodded once, and that was enough. Willow approached Russell Tate first. She sniffed his offered hand with cautious deliberation, then leaned her shoulder against his knee with a pressure that was not neediness, but selection. Russell knelt slowly, joints protesting, and murmured to her in the low, steady voice of a man accustomed to engines and wind. He promised nothing grand, only consistency, only presence, only the quiet certainty that tomorrow would look like today, and that both would be enough. Bravo launched himself at the Pemberton twins with the full, unrestrained enthusiasm of a dog who had never met a stranger he did not consider a potential accomplice. His tail was a blur. The boys froze in delighted shock. Their parents looked at Jess with the expression of people who have just realized that the next decade of their lives has been irrevocably altered and are not entirely unhappy about it. Ember did not move from Colton's side. The decision had been made weeks ago in a language that did not require words. Jess looked at Colton. Colton looked at Ember. Ember looked at no one else. Some bonds are not formed by choice, but by the recognition that a choice has already been made by something older and more reliable than reason. Adoption papers were signed. Numbers exchanged. Promises made. Willow would stay at the shelter for one more week, while Russell prepared his cottage near the marina. Bravo went home with the Pembertons, and the sound of twin boys laughing could be heard from the road as they loaded the dog into their car with the seriousness of children entrusted with something they intend to protect with their entire lives. The sun lowered toward the Pacific and painted the water in shades of gold that deepened to amber and then to the color of honey held up to light. The volunteers disassembled folding chairs. Children chased each other between fence posts. The yard emptied slowly, the way rooms empty after gatherings that mattered, with lingering conversations and reluctant departures, and the particular silence that follows the sound of many voices when the many voices have gone. Colton stood at the edge of the yard with Coda at his left side and Ember at his right. The ocean stretched below them, patient and vast. The shelter sign caught the fading light and glowed. Jess walked over. She folded the last of the paperwork into a binder and tucked it under her arm and stood beside him without speaking for a while. They watched the light change together. The wind carried the scent of salt and new wood and the distant sound of a fishing boat returning to harbor. "You could go," she said. No accusation, no plea. Just a fact presented with the same clarity she brought to everything. No one would blame you. Colton shook his head once. His eyes stayed on the horizon. "I am not running," he said. And the words carried no performance, no declaration. Just the quiet weight of a decision that had been made not in a single moment, but across a series of moments, each one small enough to miss if you were not paying attention, each one heavy enough to change the direction of a life. Dot appeared beside them. She had closed the guest book and tucked her pen into the pocket of her coat, and she stood with her hands folded and her glasses catching the last light, and her silver hair turned briefly to gold by the sun that was now touching the surface of the water. "You know," she said, and her voice carried the gentle steadiness that had comforted dying patients and frightened callers, and one grieving husband in the years before the warehouse fire took him. "Sometimes God does not part the sea in front of us. He does not send angels with trumpets or fire from the sky." She looked at the shelter, at the dogs, at the man standing beside her who had driven into a storm weeks ago with no intention of stopping and had stopped anyway. Sometimes he just sends a cry into the rain and waits to see who will listen. Colton did not respond with words, but he heard her, and the hearing was not passive. It was the active reception of something that had been offered without conditions, the way the best gifts are offered without expectation of response, without requirement of belief, simply placed in the air between two people, and left there to do whatever work it was capable of doing. The light continued to fade. Ember pressed closer to his boot. Coda leaned against his leg with a slight pressure that was not demand but presence. The two dogs who had carried him through the worst night of his recent life and the best weeks of his entire life sat on either side of him like sentinels who had completed their watch and were now simply content to remain at the post, because the post had become home. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the dog tag. He had carried it for 4 years, across states and storms and rented rooms and the vast interior distances of a man in flight from himself. It had pressed against his heartbeat through every mile, cold when he was cold, warm when the fire was lit, always there, always reminding him of a name that belonged to a man he believed had died on a helicopter floor, in a place where sand tasted like copper and the sound of rotors was the last sound before silence. He held the tag in his open palm, read the name one final time. Colton Briggs. The letters were small and stamped with military precision into steel that had dulled but not corroded, because some things are made to endure even when the person carrying them is not sure he can. Then he walked into the shelter, past the common room, past the kennels where the dogs rescued from the property were sleeping, to a small wooden shelf near the entrance that Clara Dunning had built and sanded and left unfinished because she said that some surfaces should be completed by the people who would use them. He placed the dog tag on the shelf, not hidden, not discarded, not thrown away in anger or dropped in resignation, placed deliberately in the spot where the first light of morning would reach through the east-facing window and touch the metal before it touched anything else in the room. A memorial that was not a memorial. A release that was not a forgetting. The act of a man setting down something he had carried too long and too far, and discovering that the hand once opened did not feel empty. It felt free. He stood there for a moment, looking at the tag on the shelf, then at the room around it. The room that existed because a dog had cried in a storm, and he had been close enough and broken enough and stubborn enough to stop. He walked back outside. The last of the sunlight lay in a thin gold line along the horizon, and above it, the sky had deepened to the blue that comes just before dark, the blue that is neither day nor night, but the quiet negotiation between the two. Coda and Ember waited on the porch. They had not followed him inside. They had trusted that he would come back. And he had. The next morning arrived the way mornings arrive on the Oregon coast. Slowly, with fog that the sun dissolves in patient increments, with the sound of water against rock that has been happening for longer than anyone can measure and will continue for longer than anyone can imagine. Colton stood on the cliff above the Pacific, Coda at his left, Ember at his right. The ocean spread below them enormous and calm the surface, catching the first light in small, bright points that appeared and vanished and appeared again, like signals from a place too far away to name but close enough to feel. He did not scan the tree line. He did not measure the distance to the nearest cover position. He did not count exits or calculate angles or assess the wind for threats that existed only in the architecture of a nervous system that had spent 2 decades cataloging danger. He just looked at the water. And he breathed. And the breath went all the way in and all the way out, and it did not catch on anything on its way through. Because the space inside his chest, where the weight had lived for 4 years, was not empty. It was occupied by the sound of Coda breathing beside him, by the warmth of Ember against his ankle, by the memory of a fire in a cabin and a woman with silver hair saying words that landed softly and stayed, by the knowledge that behind him on the hillside there was a building with his handprints on its beams and a dog tag on its shelf, and a sign that carried the name of a mother who had refused to leave her children in a storm. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or spectacle. Sometimes they arrive as a bark in the rain and a man willing to stop long enough to listen. Sometimes healing does not come from the thing that was planned, but from the thing that interrupted the plan. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not to charge forward, but to stand still, to remain, to let the roots go down into ground that is imperfect and uncertain and alive. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that goodness still exists. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe so we can keep bringing stories of hope and faith and second chances into everyday life. And before you go, take one quiet moment. Just one. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen you in your struggles, and remind you that even in the coldest season, His light never leaves those who choose love. If you believe that miracles still happen, type Amen in the comments below. Let that word be your prayer and your promise to keep choosing kindness wherever you stand.